How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux. It is great to be back. I really do. I know I've said this a bunch, but I really do appreciate the patience with trying to figure out day and time. But I am trying to get them out sometime in the first half of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Tuesday is the goal. Found out yesterday that I got an interview and have to fly out to Dallas next week for that interview. So I was kind of getting some of that stuff prepared yesterday because I found out in the morning, but I had to book some flights in a hotel and things like that. So I didn't really get to recording and posting the episode. So that is why it's coming out on a Wednesday. I do want to jump right into the episode because last week we did a Father's Day episode and started talking about the fathers of faith. And I only got through two of the fathers of faith in Adam and Noah. And there's a bunch more to go. And I thought I was recording a little longer than I actually was last week. So I only got to two. So this episode will probably be a little bit longer because I want to try to get through them all in this episode. If it's getting too long, I'll do a short third part for next week. But as I just stated, we started with Adam, we jumped into Noah, and the next one is Abraham. So I am going to get started. But as always, guys, please like, comment, share, subscribe. If you wouldn't mind sharing the episodes once they come out and you have the links, putting them on your socials would be a great way for us to grow. If you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment below. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give us a rating and a review. That would be super helpful. But let's go ahead and jump in with Abraham for the fathers of faith. So when we first meet Abraham, obviously his name is Abram in Genesis 12, and there isn't anything particularly extraordinary about him at this point in his life. You know, he's living in a pagan culture, although he is not living that way himself. He's already older in age, and his wife, who is Sarah, but at this point known as Sarai. So as you know, a lot of names, they switch in the Bible, going from Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, and she is unable to have children. And from a human perspective, from our perspective, there's nothing that this couple of Abraham and Sarah that suggests that they will become the foundation of God's people, right? Of this great nation. And yet this is, as we've talked about in so many episodes, exactly the type of person and people that God uses, right? So God calls Abraham to leave everything behind, right? His homeland, his family, or I should say his extended family. Obviously, he goes with his wife, his security, the plans he might have had for him and Sarah. And God doesn't hand him, this detailed roadmap of what his life is going to look like, right? Instead, he simply says, go to the land that I will show you. And I just want a lot of what we've been trying to pull from the scriptures the last month or two is to really think about it not as just a story. Like I said, sometimes we look at the scriptures, we look at these stories as like a sitcom where we don't think about the ramifications, like what happens in our lives, right? Like the consequences of a decision, even though we don't get the full details all the time of what happens, like we talked about with the friends burrowing through the roof to lower their paralyzed friend to Jesus. We don't see what happens after that, right? Did they pay to have that roof repaired? Was there a fight between them and the owner of the house? Like, we don't see all that, but obviously something happened with that because they're still people. They're still normal people like us. Like, if we damage someone's property, even if it was for a good cause or whatever, we'd have to explain ourselves. We'd have to maybe pay some money or fix that for them. There'd have to be, some sort of conclusion to that. And we don't always see all those details, but I think it's helpful for us to think, man, how much trust was required for Abraham and for Sarah just to go based on God saying, go to the land that I will show you. Right? See, we often ask God to reveal the destination before we're willing to take the first step, right? And I think that is normal, but it's something that we have to overcome to follow God. Abraham had to take the first steps before he knew where he was actually going. And we see what that in turn created down the line in the scriptures. And that's what faith really looks like, right? If we have all the answers to every step that we're going to take, no faith is required. It's trusting the character of God, even when you can't see the outcome of where, he's leading you. And, as God asked them this, time passed, right? Years passed. Years and years pass, and obviously he promised them a child even at their old age. But a bunch of time goes by. It doesn't happen right away. And I can't imagine the conversations, right, that went on at night just between Abraham and Sarah, right? We're getting older. Is this really going to happen? Did we misunderstand the promise that God gave us? He told us that we were going to be the leaders of this great nation. We were going to have all these children. Did we misunderstand? Did we hear God correctly? We've left everything behind. And if you have ever waited on God for something, you probably understand these questions that they probably had in the privacy of their residence. And so, waiting, has a way of exposing what we truly believe. Do we truly believe God has sent us down this path for a reason, or do you give up or run away? Eventually Abraham and Sarah tried to accomplish God's promise through other means, right? We'll leave it at that. But how many times have we tried to help God fulfill a promise, right? We try to cut corners, or we try to skip a step, or we go a way that we know is maybe not right, but we think it's going to make the promise come quicker. And yet they did this, tried to do it in their own way, and yet God's covenant to them remained, right? He didn't see them go their own way and decide to take that promise away, because God is faithful to his promise. So when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, Isaac was born. And I can only imagine, we know the joy of a first-time parent. We've had friends or other parts of our family where they've had their first child, or had a child in general, and you see the joy or whatever. But just imagine at 100 years old and 90 years old, the reaction of that child, right? The promise that was made, the prayers that were said, the years of waiting, and that promise is wrapped up in this little baby boy. And Isaac wasn't just Abraham's son, right? He represented the future of the covenant that God made with Abraham and Sarah about this nation that they would lead, that they would be the head of. Everything God had promised, rested in this child. And it makes Genesis 22 one of the most mind-boggling chapters in all the Bible, right? It's, this challenge that God gives Abraham to go offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And if we're honest, this account should make us pause if we don't know the rest of the story. I know many of us do know the rest of the story, but if you're reading this for the first time, you're like, wait, just promised him this child. They waited, they left everything that they knew, and Abraham loved this child. Every promise appeared to flow through Isaac, right? So why would God ask for him back? And I know many of us know this, but I think sometimes it needs to be said is that, I don't think God was testing whether Abraham loved Isaac, loved the promise that he gave him. He knows that. He knows that Abraham loves Isaac, but God was revealing, and I think this is big for us, whether Abraham trusted the giver more than the gift, right? Did he still love God and understand that God gave him that gift? And do you trust the giver, not just the child that was given? And I think that question reaches everybody, right? We've all had that. Parents naturally love their children, and as they should, but there is this temptation to believe that our children only belong to us instead of God who gave you that child. And I think scripture reminds us that they never have been just yours or just ours, but they've always been God's, right? These gifts are entrusted to our care, whether it's a child or something else in your life, right? Relationships, jobs, whatever it may be. The things that God has gifted you, belong to him. We guide them, we nurture them, we pray for them. We are good stewards over them, but ultimately they belong to God who created or gave those things to you. And Abraham's willingness to place Isaac on that altar wasn't an act of indifference. It was the highest expression of trust in God. He believed that somehow, even if I couldn't understand it, God would remain faithful to his promise, whether it was Isaac or someone else. And just before the sacrifice, God provided a ram for Abraham to sacrifice in Isaac's place. So for Abraham, he never had to kill his son, right? But one day, however, another father would stand on another hill, and this time there would be no substitute. And we know that this story is pointing towards Jesus, right? Are you willing to sacrifice your son that I gave you? You don't know this yet, but I'm going to sacrifice my son who I also gave you. But before we get to Jesus, that promise continues through Isaac from the beginning of that story back in the beginning parts of Genesis 12. And Isaac's life teach us that sometimes the greatest inheritance a father leaves behind isn't money or property or influence, but it's the faith that they pass down to us, right? So with that, we're going to jump to the next part of our journey of the fatherhood, fathers of faith. So as we ended the last part of Abraham, he stood on Mount Moriah, I believe it's pronounced, with his son beside him. Isaac had become more than a child, represented the promises of God. Abraham learned one of the hardest lessons that every parent eventually has to face. Maybe not that intense, but our children that we may have are gifts from God, and ultimately they belong to God. And that lesson didn't just end with, that asked sacrifice of Abraham. It became part of Isaac's inheritance, right? And that brings us to the truth that I think every parent and every person needs to hear, is that children, inherit far more than their parents realize, right? You see sometimes a child has the same mannerisms as their parent. They lots of times have the same values as their parents. They inherit fears, strengths, and weaknesses, our view of God and our view of the world. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, every father leaves something behind. And the question isn't whether you're leaving a legacy, it's what kind of legacy are you leaving? So we're going to talk about Abraham's son Isaac, the father who inherited faith. So Isaac is one of the quieter figures in the scriptures. When you think about patriarchs, Abraham is remembered for that faith that we just talked about. Jacob is, remembered for wrestling with God. Joseph is remembered for the dreams that he had and the forgiveness he had for his brothers after selling him into slavery. Isaac often seems to stand quietly between all of those. And perhaps it's because Isaac's story reminds us of something that isn't always celebrated. Not every generation is called to start something new. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is just faithfully carrying forward, right? What the previous generation began, just continuing on that journey. And so Isaac inherited something incredibly valuable. He inherited the knowledge of God's covenant that he made with his parents. He grew up hearing the stories. He knew about the promises God had made to Abraham and Sarah. He had witnessed his father's faith firsthand all through his life. And so I imagine him sitting around their home or a campfire as a child, and Abraham telling him about this journey, right? Imagine hearing about God's promise to make descendants as numerous of the stars. Imagine hearing the story of Mount Moriah, not from strangers, but from your own father. The stories would be something that shaped Isaac's understanding of who God is, right? And it's fascinating that faith can be inherited, and not just borrowed. I think we learn that as we get older, especially if you grew up in a religious setting, is that lots of times when you're a child and even into your teenage years, you're just borrowing the faith that your parents are passing down to you. But as you get older, as you leave for college and, maybe you're not around your family nearly as much, you can't just live off that borrowed faith. You have to acquire and build your own faith, right? Every son, every daughter has to decide whether the faith that their parents had and passed to them, that they'll take that and make it their own. There comes a moment when, my parents believe has to become I believe. And I know I had to go through that for sure. I think I realized how much I was just weaning off my parents and my sister's faith and the people around me at my church growing up, that I just weaned off of their faith. And I didn't necessarily, not that I had none of my own, I believed in God, but I didn't know why I believed in God, why I believed the stories from the scriptures. And when I went off to college, I really had to dig and find that for myself, which really made my faith stronger and obviously more real. Isaac reached that point, right? Throughout his life, God repeatedly reaffirmed the covenant directly to him. God wasn't simply Abraham's God anymore. It was also Isaac's God. He became Isaac's God, not just the story from his father, but truly his own. And I think that that's an important reminder for us that are, if you're a parent, especially if you're a father, if you're raising children, that we can't just tell them about God. We have to help them experience God for themselves. We can teach, we can pray for them, we can answer questions, but we can model what faith should look like, but eventually they have to encounter God on their own. It has to become a personal faith. I think one of the dangers of Christian homes is that, and I've seen this a lot having worked with families and teenagers, is that they can assume that the exposure to church, the exposure to youth group, the exposure to sermons on Sundays and singing the songs and having friends in church automatically produces transformation. And when it doesn't happen, and this isn't all families, but when it doesn't happen, we ask, oh, like, why aren't you doing this or you doing that? When oftentimes it's like, one, you have to look to yourself as a parent, but also you just have to know that your child makes their own decisions, and you can force them to do this or that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to turn to transformation. It has to be something that they eventually decide on their own, that I want to follow God or I don't. And you have to let go and let them learn on their own of the consequences of actions, but also the great reward of having your own faith and having your own relationship with God and what that truly brings to your life. Like we talked about, kids can grow up attending church every week and hearing the stories and memorizing verses and knowing all the books of the Bible and singing that song and whatnot, and still never surrender their own heart to Christ. Faith is communal, but it's also deeply personal. Having your own relationship with God, and something I was taught, and I think sometimes in a negative way, or I think it was done in a negative way, but with good intention, and the point still is true, is when I was growing up, like when you would go through Bible studies to eventually get baptized and become a Christian, there would be this question when you're like counting the cost, we would call it, right? Where you're counting the cost, like, do you really want to follow God? Because it comes with this expectation, this expectation, this expectation. Are you willing to do that? Which I think is good, to count the costs and ask yourself, man, am I willing to follow the commands of God? But a question that would get asked, which I think was a little intense, especially for a teenager, maybe could have been spoke about in a different way, is, they would ask, like, if everybody left, like if your mom and dad left God, if your siblings left God, if all your friends left God and you were the only one left, like, would you still follow God? And although that's intense, and again, I think could have been talked about in a different way, it's true though. Like, if you don't have your deep personal faith, then why would you stay? If your friends left or your sibling left or your parents left, like, why would you stay if you don't have a deep personal faith? Our parents and our families, they plant the seeds and God waters it, and we can water it, but God makes it grow, right? But Isaac also teaches us another lesson. It's that children often imitate more than they innovate, right? Like, before they're old enough, they imitate what they see more than they innovate their own actions. Have you ever noticed that Isaac, repeated one of Abraham's mistakes? Just as Abraham had lied about Sarah out of fear, Isaac later lied about Rebecca for the same reason. When I first kind of put two and two together and noticed that connection, it stuck with me how easily that patterns can move generation through generation, right? We talk about how maybe alcohol addiction or who you might go after as a partner sometimes can be passed down by how our parents were, our grandparents, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes we pass down good things like faith and courage, but we also pass down, fear and anger and pride and, all these things that we don't intentionally want to pass down those things to our children, but it happens. And obviously, as we become adults, we have to take accountability for our own actions. We can't continue to blame the generations that came before us, but we have to understand, for the kids, that are in our care, whether you're a parent or whether you're just teaching kids at church or whatever the case may be, we have to know that we have to do our best to pass down the strengths that God has given us. And obviously we're all not perfect, so we're gonna pass down negative things. But we have to try to do our best to build a great foundation for the children that are in our care. Kids are always learning from us, even the things we're not intentionally teaching. And that truth should humble every parent and every person that's listening to this, because our children, rarely become what we tell them to become. They often become what they see, and obviously eventually their own choices and things of that nature. But Thankfully, those unhealthy patterns don't have to continue forever. Like we talked about, those things can be broken. The grace of God is powerful enough to break cycles that have extended generations through generations. I've seen it. I've seen it with people that I know, that are like, man, I am going to end up divorced. I'm going to end up with a drinking problem. I'm going to end up with a drug problem. I'm going to sleep around because that's what my dad did. That's what my mom did. That's what my grandfather did, whatever the case may be. And I've seen those patterns broken through the grace of God. It really becomes important when we arrive at Isaac's son in the scriptures, a man named Jacob. And we're going to talk about Jacob now, a father who learned that grace. If Abraham teaches us about faith, Jacob teaches us about transformation. When Jacob enters the biblical story, he's known more for deception than devotion, right? His very name becomes associated with manipulation and striving. He deceives his brother, he deceives his father, and later, he himself would be deceived by others. His life seemed to illustrate this painful pattern and this painful truth, and that is that sin often creates cycles. The deception Jacob practiced eventually became the deception that Jacob experienced. And yet, even in that mess that Jacob created, God never abandoned the covenant that was given. And I think that should encourage every person and every parent, family, or whatever that's listening. Some people would assume that once a family becomes super dysfunctional and you have all those patterns that travel through generation, that God would just derail this plan and just go in another direction. But the Bible over and over tells us such a different story than what would happen without God. God works right in the middle of broken situations and all of broken families, right? Jacob's household was anything but peaceful. He married Leah and he married Rachel, and jealousy consumed that household. The competition between those relationships kind of divided the relationships themselves. Favoritism poisoned the dynamic of that family, and the consequences of those actions kind of echoed through the next generation, right? And I think the clearest example was Jacob's relationship with Joseph. Genesis tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons. And I think it's hard to overstate how damaging that favoritism can be inside of a family, right? Children notice that, even if it's not spoken out loud, they often sense this unequal affection and whatnot. And I think that can be so damaging. And when I say this, that also can be a misconception too, right? Like, I think sometimes kids can look and be like, oh, you love this. That happened with me. When I was a teenager, I had decided I didn't want to follow God anymore. And my sister was still, at going to church and doing fine. She was in college at that point. And I remember that Satan had allowed me to think like my parents love my sister more than they love me. And I stated that to my mom at one point as a teenager. And, that wasn't true for us. But I think, Satan had allowed me to skew my vision. But there can be situations where there is favoritism in a household. And I think that kids can perceive that for themselves. And Satan will really attack that. And he attacked it for me when it wasn't even true. It was just something that I was perceiving, based off of me not wanting to be a part of God's family at that point in my life. But children notice that. And, Jacob's favoritism created this resentment that eventually erupted into hatred, as we spoke about a little earlier, and his sons sold Joseph into slavery. They lied to their father for years, convincing him that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. And I just imagine Jacob holding Joseph's robe that was bloodstained. And I imagine the grief that he had, believing for decades that your son was just gone forever and you never got to say goodbye. And as heartbreaking as that story is, it reminds us that even godly people can make parenting mistakes, right? With lasting consequences. And I think that, I don't want anyone to feel pressure that you have to be the perfect parent or the perfect friend, the perfect Christian, because no one is. But I think sometimes, the message that's unintentionally given is that biblical fathers always got everything right, and we need to live up to that expectation. And I think sometimes we put the great stories of the Bible on a pedestal and we kind of push the negative stories to the side. Even when we read them, sometimes we're like, yeah, but he did this and this and this. And I think it's good to focus on these great victory stories of the Bible, but we also have to remember, again, like I keep saying, these people are just like us, just as broken as us, if not more sometimes. And so I just want you to know, if you're a parent that's listening, to not get caught up and think that, the fathers and the mothers and the sons and the daughters of the scriptures are these perfect people, but they make mistakes just like us, and the Bible tells us that, it's us that make the mistake of just looking at the victories and stuff. The Bible tells us the defeats. It's just sometimes we don't look at them as close as an eye as the victory stories, and it makes fathers who loved God. It shows us that fathers who loved God still struggled to lead their homes wisely sometimes. And scripture isn't asking us to imitate every decision that these men and women made. It's inviting us to trust that God will remain faithful despite us making the mistakes that these men and women also made. But eventually, Jacob's story reaches this turning point, right? After years of running and manipulating and depending on his own strength, Jacob wrestled with God through the night. When morning came, he walked with a limp. God changed his name to Jacob, or I'm sorry, from Jacob to Israel. And I've always kind of thought about him wrestling and him having that limp, and God could have healed him, right? Like, let me take care of that limp for you. We're good. But God, changes his name, but and then instead he allowed Jacob to carry that limp. And perhaps it's that every step afterward reminded him that his strength had never been enough, right? He needed God, that he couldn't make it through on his own strength. And that was a reminder of that. And that's just me speculating, but I just thought it was something that was really interesting. And I think for all of us, like, maybe we all have something that is like equivalent to that limp from Jacob that we carry, and it might not be a physical limp like Jacob's, but a spiritual one, a regret, a failure, words that you wish you had or hadn't spoken, right? Years you wish you could relive and do something different, relationships you wish you could go back and change or never have in the first place, or make a different decision. But Jacob reminds us that God doesn't only work through perfect people, perfect examples, perfect situations. He works through people that are surrendered to him. And I think sometimes that the most powerful testimony that a father or a parent can give his children isn't pretending that he never failed. It's showing them what repentance from failure looks like, showing them what humility looks like, admitting your mistakes, getting help, showing them that, what it means to depend completely on God's grace. And I think understanding God's grace is huge. I know that was something for me in my young adulthood. I was very guilty conscious, and I can still struggle with that at times. But, I was helped to understand that when I was not forgiving myself or being hard on myself or having that guilty conscience is because I didn't understand or was too prideful to accept God's grace. Children don't need parents who never apologize. They need fathers and mothers that know how to seek forgiveness and accept it, right? And that kind of humility can reshape an entire family and cut off those generations of negative things in some people's case, right? As Jacob approached the end of his life, he gathered his sons together, he blessed them, and one blessing stood apart from the others, and it was spoken over Judah. And that's who we'll speak about next, the father of the promise. If you've ever read Genesis, and if you can remember back to maybe the first time you read it or whatever, Judah probably wouldn't have been a story you really like honed in on or whatever. Judah's earlier in life included failure and compromise and, a not great moral. And yet that is often, as we always talk about, what God works through. He delights in choosing people the world would cast away or overlook. And when Jacob blessed Judah, he spoke words that reached beyond his own lifetime, right? He says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. And in other words, what he's saying is that kings would come through this family line, that the kings would come from Judah. And at the time, Israel didn't even have a king, right? Hundreds of years before David was born, God was already revealing, where that royal line to David and eventually Jesus would begin. And I want you to think about what that really, really means, is that generation after generation, fathers within, Judah's family carried something far bigger than they would ever understand in their own lifetimes, right? They weren't merely just raising another child, raising another child, raising another child. They were preserving the line that Jesus himself would eventually come from. And that becomes powerful. And when you understand that, you start to read the scriptures differently of all these people that we're learning about and seeing their victories and failures, that it's all leading up and pointing to Jesus. And as you see that arc of the scriptures play out, it's beautiful. And if you don't understand that, then you're just reading words and you don't grasp how much, when people talk about, they have the misunderstanding that the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament. No, 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 no. It was all one story pointing to Jesus, and everything that happened was for a reason. And God gave his people chance after chance after chance. And when you understand that, you realize that God was never a harsh God. In fact, he was way more patient than we could have ever been and would ever be. And that's just a powerful thing once you realize these people weren't just having a bunch of kids and we're not just reading these stories about positive and negative things. They're preserving a line that would lead to Jesus. Every birth mattered, every generation mattered. Every father became another link in the chain to the redemption of Jesus. And when you realize that, the Bible just means so much more. It reminds me that ordinary faithfulness often has these extraordinary consequences we can't yet see, right? Most fathers and parents never know the full impact of their influence. Perhaps the prayers that you have will strengthen a child one day that leads a bunch of people to Christ. You don't know what that child's impact could have. Perhaps your example of faith and integrity will inspire your grandchildren, after you're gone, stories that still are told. Perhaps the conversations around the dinner table will echo into generations that you never meet, right? I love that quote from Gladiator, right? Is that what you do now will echo in eternity. And that could be good or it could be bad. But we tend to measure success by what happens in our lifetime, but there's so much that we can affect that gets passed down to generations after us and after we will pass. And I think God measures those things across generations as we see in the scriptures, right? It's not these singular stories. And although we read them that way sometimes where we jump around, right? We hear one sermon about Abraham, then we hear one sermon about Isaac, and we hear one, and maybe they're months apart. And so, we don't connect them unless we do our own reading and understand what the Bible is really showing us and teaching us, the love story that it is, the poems that are written, the stories that are told, the love that is had, like all those things, they lead to one person. Judah probably never imagined that centuries later, the savior of the world would be called the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? We kind of forget that. We kind of say like, oh yeah, the Lion of Judah. But it started there, generations and generations, and all the mistakes that he made and the deception and all those things that came from his line led to the Lion of Judah. That was Jesus. And that's exactly what God was preparing. The promise kept moving that started way back with Abraham and Sarah. Generation after generation, father after father, it just moved closer and closer to Bethlehem. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about next, right? How fatherhood shaped the story of the Bible. Every father pointed to the father. As we finished the last part, we were with Judah, listening to Jacob pronounce a blessing that would echo through history. And at the time, no one imagined exactly what those words meant. There was no kingdom. There wasn't a nation, of what we think of Israel today. God had already declared that kings would come through Judah's family before there was any evidence of it. And that reminds me of something that I think we overlook or forget sometimes, is that God is never reacting to history. He is writing it, right? Long before David was born, God already knew who David would be. Long before Bethlehem became famous, God knew it would become the birthplace of Jesus. And long before Joseph held the infant Jesus in his arms, God had already written the story of redemption from the foundation of the world. Generation after generation, fathers continue passing along this promise without fully understanding where it was leading ultimately. And so eventually the promise arrived at the house of an ordinary shepherd named Jesse. And Jesse is the father who didn't see the king. I've always found Jesse's story very interesting because it reminds us how limited our perspective can be. When the prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, Jesse would have felt honored. Samuel was one of the most respected men in Israel, and if he came to your home, you assume that something important was about to happen, right? So Samuel explains that God had sent him to anoint Israel's next king. And I just imagine, like this ordinary shepherd, this ordinary man, imagine him hearing that, as a father that, I'm here to find the next king of Israel. And I'm sure, Jesse, he calls his sons in, and one by one they stood, in front of Samuel. And, he calls his first son, Eliab, is I think how you pronounce it. And he looked exactly like the kind of man you would expect to become the next king, right? He was tall, he was impressive, carried himself with confidence. And even Samuel, it says, thought to himself, surely he is the Lord's anointed, right? Surely this is the guy that's going to be the next king. But then God interrupted that thought process and he said, do not consider his appearance or his height. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So the next son came, and 7 sons stood before Samuel, and 7 times God said, nope, not that one, not that one. And finally, Samuel asked a question because he's like, all right, well, God can't be wrong. Like, why did he send me here, right? And he's like, are these all the sons that you have? And it's crazy to think that David wasn't even considered by his own father, right? He wasn't invited to stand before and say, is this son going to be the king? Because he was like, surely it won't be David. So I'm not even going to worry about calling him in. He was out tending to the sheep because no one expected God to choose that one, right? And, before we kind of make our assumptions about Jesse as a father, it's worth remembering that, he wasn't rejecting David. He just simply couldn't see what God already saw in David. And I think that that's true of all of us, right? I'm sure that we have underestimated what God was doing because it didn't look like, God, what are you trying to show me? Why'd you give me this job? Why'd you choose this path for me? But God sees things so differently than us, right? And I'm sure that there's parents that have overlooked gifts in one child because they weren't as outwardly focused as the other child. I'm sure that happens all the time. Naturally, one child is maybe more outgoing and the other is more quiet. And I think that can be difficult as a parent. So basically what I'm saying is don't judge Jesse because we see that in every home, right? Like, for me growing up, like I said, like I don't feel as if my parents showed favoritism towards me or towards my sister, but me and my sister had very different interests, very different gifts. My sister was naturally pushed in strive for great academic achievement, and she had this own drive to study and make sure she knew what she was doing, even going into college. Like, I've been thinking about it recently, and I was always a naturally good student, but I didn't push myself the same way my sister pushed herself academically. And because of that, my sister went out of her way to know what she needed to do for college and how to apply and all these things. And I think that my parents, because she was good at that and she's older than me, I think it was kind of assumed like Chase will be able to do that too. And looking back on it, I was like, man, I didn't know what I was doing when I was going to college. And my life around that time was a little chaotic, and my dad's business had moved. So he was away the last year of high school for me, and it was just me and my mom had work. And so it was just like, looking back on it, I was like, man, I didn't even know what I was doing to try to apply for college, and like the SAT, like all the stuff that my sister just knew how to do because she figured it out and she was driven academically, when I was more pushed towards sports and being a little bit more outgoing and doing all these extracurriculars. In the last 6 months of my senior year, I was like, oh shoot, like, what do I do? Like, how do I apply to colleges? Like, all these things. And so I'm trying to figure things out last minute. And my point being is that we just had very different strengths and weaknesses and interests. And that didn't mean that, her strengths were better than mine or my strengths were better than her. They were just different. And that's why I say that Jesse just saw his sons and didn't think that David's strength was to become king. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, the long point that I'm trying to make. Our temptation is to celebrate what the world celebrates, right? The outward facing gifts, the one that can speak well in front of everybody, the one that can sing a song in front of everybody. And sometimes we leave the more background skills and talents behind, but God does not do that. God always looked deeper. And eventually David came in from the fields. He's dirty, covered in dust and probably stink from the sheep. He certainly didn't look like a king, yet God said, raise and anoint him. This is the one. And I can't imagine what Jesse must have been thinking of, this one, the small one, the youngest, the shepherd. Sometimes God chooses people that even those closest to them fail to see, their talent and their special abilities or special gifts that have been given to them. But that should encourage every parent that your child doesn't need to be the tall, athletic, speaks well, sings well child to be chosen by God for a powerful future. Your responsibility isn't to decide who your child will become. Your responsibility is to faithfully nurture who God created them to be. You may not fully understand the calling of God and what he has placed on their life, or maybe even your own life. Because, Jesse certainly didn't hear, but God definitely did, which brings us to David, who is a great king, but a complicated father, as we are talking about fathers. But David is one of the greatest figures in all of the scriptures, right? You see his high highs. He defeated Goliath. He unified Israel. He wrote much of Psalms. He was called a man after God's own heart. But one thing that I appreciate the most about the Bible is that it refuses to hide David's failures. And that's why I think that David is a lot of people's just favorite character, or they relate the most to him, because he does have these high highs, but he has these incredibly low lows. Yet he's still a man after God's own heart. And I think that a lot of those complicated things for David came especially as a father. We celebrate biblical fathers as though they got everything right, as we talked about earlier. And I'm not saying we always do that, but David reminds us that someone can love God deeply and still struggle tremendously in their home life. David experienced public victory, but privately his family was marked by pain, right? His sin with Bathsheba, it didn't remain isolated, and rarely sin does remain just with us. The consequences rippled through their household for generations, right? His daughter Tamar was assaulted by her half-brother Amnon. David was full of anger, and yet the scriptures records very little action from David, right? Like, he was angry, but there wasn't much action from David as a father. His silence created this space for bitterness to grow. And eventually Absalom murdered Amnon in revenge, right? Years later, Absalom led a rebellion against his own father, and I'm sure there was so much heartbreak. And David, who faced bears and lions and Goliath and armies, had these deep wounds that came from inside his own home. And I think that is just beautiful that the scriptures show that. And I know that the consequences of his sin isn't beautiful. That's not what I'm saying. But no matter how big your accomplishments may be to the public, you still have to love and care for your own home. And that's something that David struggled with vastly, right? And I think that should help us see that we need to approach our own lives, but especially for parents, with humility. Sometimes people assume that if you love God enough, your family will never experience hardship. And that's never a promise that God gives us with our families, or just in general with our lives. David's life shows us that children have free will. Parents make mistakes, that life becomes complicated, and sometimes faithful people still experience painful outcomes because they're still sinful and there's still consequences of the actions that he had. So if you're a father or a mother listening today and carrying regret, I do think that David's story tells us that you're not alone. Maybe you wish you spent more time with your children, or that you worked too much, or you allowed anger to become normal in the household, and you weren't there emotionally, even though maybe you were there physically, or maybe you just didn't feel like you knew what you were doing, and therefore you were a weak parent. But I think this shows that regret is real, but regret doesn't have to become the identity for you as a parent or as a person. And I think David's greatest moments weren't the ones where he pretended to be perfect. His greatest moments were when he repented, which David did do, to his credit. If you read Psalms, you'll discover a man who continually brought his brokenness before God. And that's what I love about David's story, man. He's so complicated. He had these high highs and these low lows, as we talked about, but he always came back and brought that brokenness from those big mistakes in front of God. He confessed, he wept, he worshiped, he trusted God's mercy. And I think that that's his greatest gift as a father that he could have given his children. Not the illusion of perfection, but the example of repentance. Children don't need parents and fathers who never fail. They need parents who know where to go when they do. But David wasn't the end of the story, right? The prophets began speaking of another king, a greater son of David, one whose kingdom would never end. And as we know, the promise continued to move forward generation after generation to Jesus. And that's where we will jump forward a bit to Joseph, the quiet father. When we think about fathers in the scriptures, I think Joseph is overlooked because he's not the biological father of Jesus, and there was a lot of controversy around the miracle pregnancy of Mary, and I think that the scriptures record very few words that he actually spoke, right? We don't really hear a lot from Joseph, and yet his silence shouldn't be mistaken for insignificance, right? Joseph may be one of the clearest pictures of faithful fatherhood in all of the scriptures, a lot of what I was just alluding to, but consider what was asked of him, right? We'll go a little bit deeper into the thing that I was kind of talking about is, he was engaged to Mary, and when he discovered she was pregnant, from his perspective, there was only one explanation, right? There was only one thing that it could have possibly meant, and that was that Mary had slept with someone else, right? And that is a logical conclusion that, this pregnancy wasn't just out of nowhere. Sorry, I lost my place here. Let me just get back to where I was. Forgive me. It's what happens when you have too many notes. Yeah, so for him, his perspective, there was only that one explanation, right? And he must have been heartbroken and shattered. He thought that he was just cheated on, that, he wasn't going to marry the woman of his dreams, and that she had been with someone else. I'm sure he was shattered. And, Matthew tells us that Joseph was a righteous man. And notice what righteousness looked like, right? He wasn't interested in embarrassing Mary publicly, which I think almost anyone would have done, right? He wasn't driven by revenge. Even in what he believed was betrayal, he desired mercy for Mary, right? And then an angel appeared and it changed everything, right? Joseph was told that Mary's child had been conceived by the Holy Spirit. And I'm sure that must have been overwhelming. Most people I think would have run from that responsibility. This still isn't actually my child, even though I know, okay, like this woman wasn't unfaithful to me. But despite all that, Joseph stepped towards it, right? He chose obedience. He accepted this misunderstanding and this confusion that he must have had. And, he accepted the whispers from other people because, people didn't believe that. When they told the neighbors, they were still whispering about it and gossiping about it. And he accepted the burden of raising a child who ultimately belonged to God. And when we say that, it's not metaphorically like we talk about now, how our children don't belong to us, they belong to God. This child literally belonged to God, right? Like, it wasn't this hypothetical for like, yes, this kid is mine, but it's ultimately God's. Like, no, this child is God's completely. Joseph never performed miracles or preached sermons, never wrote books of the Bible. He just showed up for Jesus day after day. He worked. He protected him. He led them to Egypt when Herod, sought to kill Jesus. He brought them safely home after that. He taught Jesus the trade of carpentry. He faithfully embraced the ordinary responsibility of fatherhood, which really isn't ordinary. Sometimes I think we underestimate the holiness that is just the obedience and the faithfulness. Culture often tells us that fathers, the significance come through raising a kid that becomes famous or wealthy or has all these achievements. But Joseph reminds us that, significance often looks just like consistency and showing up, providing for your family, keeping your word, remaining faithful, choosing integrity when no one is watching, being present. And some of the greatest fathers who've ever lived, don't have stories written about them. They just loved their families. And I think that this is, although this isn't, a one-to-one comparison, but I think that's the case for stepfathers and fathers that aren't biologically tied to a child but still show up for that child. I think that's the example that Joseph set. He just simply loved his family. And yet Joseph understood that, something profound is, and it was that Jesus wasn't ultimately his son. He had been entrusted with someone who belonged to God. And that brings us to the one every other, father has been pointing towards, the perfect father. We've walked through the last couple episodes through Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Jesse, David, and Joseph. And each one teaches us something beautiful about fatherhood. And each one reminds us of its limitations. Adam failed, Noah stumbled, Abraham doubted, Isaac repeated unhealthy patterns, Jacob played favorites, David made devastating mistakes. Joseph, though faithful, was still an ordinary man. And every earthly father eventually reaches the limits of his strength and power, right? That's why none of them were ever meant to be the destination. They were signs pointing towards Jesus, pointing towards someone greater. And when Jesus came, he constantly spoke about his Father. He taught his disciples to pray, "Our Father." He revealed a Father who welcomes, prodigal sons home. A Father who knows that, what we need before we ask him of it. A Father who gives us good gifts. A Father who leaves the 99 and pursues the one that's lost. Everything Jesus did revealed the heart of God. And at the cross, we witnessed something extraordinary, right? Centuries earlier, Abraham climbed a mountain with Isaac, as we talked about at the beginning of this episode. And at the last moment, God provided a ram and Isaac was spared, right? But on another hill outside of Jerusalem, another father offered his son. And this time there wasn't a substitute, right? Because Jesus was the substitute. He was that ram for us. We were Isaac that should have been sacrificed, and Jesus became that ram. The father was willing to, the Father willingly gave what Abraham never had to. God gave us Jesus, and not because he loved Jesus less than Abraham loved Isaac, obviously, but because he loved us so much so we would have a chance. The cross is not just a picture of, the son's love, it's a picture of the Father's love. We obviously, and for good reason, look at it as Jesus's love for us, but also God's love for us. The greatest act of fatherhood in history wasn't keeping his son from suffering. It was willingly giving Jesus so that the rest of his children could have the chance to come home. Every father that we studied in these episodes carried the promise, right? God the Father fulfilled that promise. Every earthly father points beyond himself towards the perfect Father, towards the perfect Son, towards the perfect redemption, and it changed everything. Right. So as we come to a close in this last part, and I know this episode's a little long, but I didn't want to cut up this third part. I think this is powerful to see this all together. But I want us to pause for a moment and look back down this road that we traveled. I know we jumped through a little bit here just before this, but we began in the Garden of Eden with Adam, the first father, right, who experienced both the beauty of walking with God and the heartbreak of introducing sin and shame to the world. We stood and we talked about Noah, and, as he quietly built this ark, the world mocked his obedience. We talked about Abraham and we learned that we have to trust God because he trusted God with the son that he loved and was promised, and then he was spared. We saw Jacob discover God's grace, and is greater. God's grace is greater than our failure. We talked about Judah. We watched Jesse overlook the king in his own home. We talked about how David and how he had these great highs, but these low lows, and Joseph, how he raised Jesus with humility and obedience. And every one of these men was so different, right? Some were bold and brash. Some were quiet. Some led nations, and like Joseph, some simply led their families. They left us these incredible examples, and some left us painful warnings as well, right? And yet I think every one of them had something in common, is that none of them were perfect. And I think that that's one of the more encouraging things in all of Scripture, is that, as we've been saying, the Bible never asks us to place our hope in all of our hope in our human fathers. It asks us to learn from them while placing our ultimate hope in God, who is the perfect Father. And that matters because every person listening, has a different story. Some of you had great fathers who you love deeply. Some of you had, more difficult relationships with your father. But when you think of your dad, or you think of someone who was a father figure, maybe you think about the prayers that they prayed with you, the long conversations, the great memories, the laughter, the dinners, at the table in your home, the baseball games you went to, or maybe you went fishing with your father, the encouragement that they gave you, but also someone who constantly pointed you towards Christ. And like I said, maybe it wasn't your physical father, but a mentor. And if that's your story, thank God for it. Good fathers are one of God's greatest gifts. They're not perfect, but they're a reflection of his grace. And like I said, others of you maybe had a different situation. Maybe you had fathers who worked tirelessly and you didn't get to spend as much time, and they struggled to express affection, or maybe they loved you the best they knew how, but they didn't learn how to express those things with words. Those I'm proud of yous and I love yous. and you look back, and many of us begin to realize that our parents were carrying burdens that we never knew about. And I think that's where we can extend grace. They weren't superheroes, they were ordinary people trying to navigate life while raising us children. And maybe some of you had very sad stories, where your father wasn't present, he left or passed away, or addiction consumed him, or anger defined your home, or whatever it may be. And if that's your experience, I want you to hear something clearly, and that is that the father who failed you here on earth, does not define the heart of your heavenly Father. And so I know sometimes, so often, we look at God through the lens of how we looked at our own fathers, and that is a big mistake for us to make. And I think that that's one of the strategies of Satan, is convincing us that God must be like the people who hurt me most, or the father or the man that hurt me most. But Jesus came to reveal that the Father is nothing like our fears of other men or other father figures in our lives. He is faithful when others were unfaithful. He's patient when others are impatient. He's gentle when others are harsh. He remains present when others walk away from our lives. His love is not based on your performance or how well you can memorize scripture. It's rooted in his character. That doesn't erase the pain that you may have experienced from your father or others in your life, but it does mean that your story doesn't have to end with that pain. Like we said at the very beginning, and I know it's a couple weeks outside of Father's Day now, but Father's Day can be bittersweet depending on your story. But just know that, God shows up so differently than anything else, and God looks at you so differently than anyone else, right? He measures success differently. Faithfulness, integrity, humility, love, patience, those are the things that God looks at. A willingness to admit when you're wrong, a commitment to point your family towards Christ. Those are the things that echo into eternity, right? So as we close here, I had a lot more written, but I'm going to close it there. But I do really hope that this helped. And maybe you have a complicated history with your father, and you struggle at looking at God and just men in your life with trust in this willingness to put aside those things from your past. And I just hope that God can repair that for you, that you can see God in all the things that he has in store for you, and that he loves you and he's present. He'll never leave you. But happy Father's Day. Happy late Father's Day to all the fathers that are watching. But I love you guys. I really do hope that this story was compelling, and, walking through the scriptures and seeing all these fathers. I just loved putting this together. And as always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. We really want to make this podcast grow so we can really impact people's lives and help people hear the story of God. And a lot of those connections I was talking about, we want people to learn that these aren't just isolated stories that don't matter, but it's this beautiful woven love story leading up to Jesus and showing us the perfect son and the perfect father. So I love you guys. And as Jordan always says, I'm out. See you next week.